Welcome back. All right, so a video that I've done before on this channel, but I'm going to do it for 2022, 2023 as well as. So how would we come up with a scenario where any of these teams on this board, all 32 teams in the league, how they would win a Stanley Cup? So I'm going to go through this in alphabetical order. Apologies to Winnipeg, but I've been doing, 32 team videos, and I haven't been doing alphabetical order that often, so it shouldn't be a big deal. Anyways, starting with Anaheim and Arizona. So this is where it gets kind of tough, but it's easier to make the argument for Anaheim. You would need Gibson to have an absolutely fantastic year. Klingberg would have to be a linchpin on that blue line, and Zegras would have to take not just the next step, but absolutely become a megastar. You would need a lot of young players to fast track. Drysdale as well. So for the Ducks to win a Stanley Cup in 2023, they'd need a lot of things to fall their way, and Gibson to look like Shesterkin did last year. So that to me is the formula by which Anaheim would have that best chance. Arizona, it is tough to make an argument for Arizona without it delving into sarcasm. It really, Arizona's in full tank mode. The plan this year is still to be pretty bad. There's some young guys here. There's some good players in the organization, definitely. I think if Vejmelka and Ingram are going to be their tandem, it'll be interesting to see how that goes and if Ingram can hold that spot. But to argue for a Stanley Cup, and again, without resorting to jokes and sarcasm, it is very difficult to make that argument for Arizona. Keller would have to make that superstar ascension, and that blue line would have to be a heck of a lot better than what we think it's going to be this year for Arizona. Boston, fountain of youth. They need for Bergeron and Krejci to look like they did 10 years ago. They also need for Marchand to come back and be 100% healthy. Either Swayman or Ullmark to really emerge as a number one, a true number one. I think they both had decent stats last year. I don't think that either of them necessarily grabbed that spot as the true number one goaltender for Boston. And now maybe under Jim Montgomery. Maybe it'll be Swayman's job, but it's possible. And then it ends up being Ullmark's as well. Ullmark's certainly being paid as a starting goaltender, so we'll see what happens. But that's the only way I can see Boston winning a Stanley Cup. Buffalo, for Buffalo, it would be a matter of them getting into the playoffs, being taken for granted, taken lightly, and having one of their goaltenders go on a bit of a run. And I'm talking like Halak back in 2010 kind of run. Alex Tuck would have to, continue to make steps. Tage Thompson can't fall back. Skinner would have to have another good year. Dahlin, and if Power can be, Calder worthy, I think that's a way that you get there. But for Buffalo, they've never won a cup. It'd be great to see them win a cup in my lifetime. Calgary. For Calgary, it's a little bit easier. Really, they have to hit the ground running to start the season, not have any kind of a tough period with Huberdeau, and just keep rolling through the regular season, that confidence being up in the playoffs. Markstrom can't have the kind of playoff that he did last season. Can't have that glove hand being exposed in the playoffs. And it's something that happened to him when he was a Canuck against St. Louis, and then he fixed it, so he's going to have to fix that again. But for Calgary, it is definitely easier to argue them than I think anybody else on the board to that point. Calgary, I think, has a decent chance this year. They do. But again, Canadian team, it'd be nice to finally see a Canadian team win a Stanley Cup. And I am to the point where I don't care which one it is. I don't care anymore. I really don't. I mean, it'd be great if it was Vancouver, but yeah, right. Anyways, just 40 years of experience sort of caused the giggle. But yeah, Calgary, I think they have a decent chance. But Carolina's one of the favorites. And I've seen some picking Carolina to win a cup, and yes. But for Carolina, the health of Freddie Anderson could go a long way to deciding whether or not they win a Stanley Cup. Yeah, Antti Ranta, you can get through a round. Freddie Anderson, I think just those years of doubt that he went through, and I don't mean necessarily him doubting himself, but people doubting him, and but if it's a big game, I don't know, Freddie Anderson. I think Anderson's a good playoff goaltender, and I think if he can channel that frustration with years and years of being taken, being doubted, I think it can happen. They need to be able to score goals in the playoffs. Really, and it just seems so simple, but I think the reins need to be loosened a little bit on this team in the playoffs, and if so, Carolina can score their way to a Stanley Cup with solid goaltending. Chicago, Chicago's not easy. Kane and Taves would have to get off to tremendous starts and force this team into a position where they're going to be a playoff team. And Luke Richardson would be coach of the year if this team gets to the playoffs. Like, that's just simple to look at and deduce. A Stanley Cup, you'd have to have Mrazek stand on his head a little bit. You'd have to have the leadership of Taves really take over. And I guess Seth Jones has a tremendous playoff run in him at some point, maybe this year, that kind of thing, right? Again, if you're arguing for Chicago, it gets tough, which is interesting because right after Chicago, you got Colorado. The defending Stanley Cup champions, they're my pick right now. I will maintain that pick to win a Stanley Cup until we're going to the playoffs, and then I do make that change if needed. Sometimes I don't. But Colorado, yeah, there's a reason that they're being favored by many as well. It's a really solid lineup. They do lose Kadri, but I think they'll be okay. I think they need Newhook to make that, that developmental step. I think he's solid, good player for them, and looking forward to seeing what he can do. So yeah, Colorado. I mean, they have so many weapons. It's just ridiculous. Colorado could do it again. Columbus. Well, Johnny Hockey has to have a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Has to play that way. I think that, Elvis had a good year, not a great year, and I think he needs to have a great year. And obviously, for almost any team to be argued for the Cup, the goaltending is going to be a big part of that. Even as we have the discussion about whether or not you need an elite-level goaltender to win a Stanley Cup. Because, Kemper wasn't considered to be elite last year. But he was pretty elite in the second half of the season. It was just once we got into the postseason, his numbers kind of took a bit of a dive. But for Columbus, I do have them in the playoffs this year. We'll see if they do make the playoffs. And if they do, it's possible. Columbus has never gone past the second round. Maybe, right? Dallas is a tough one to argue as well. They need goals. It really has been a matter of they don't score enough. So everybody focused on Ottinger and how great he was in that series against Calgary. Agreed. But did they get the key goals when they needed them themselves? No. So Ottinger stood on his head, had a save percentage, .954, something ridiculous in that series against Calgary. But if not, Calgary wins that series easily. If Ottinger had put up normal, regular goaltending numbers, then Dallas would have been out earlier than that. And I think we'd be having a different conversation this summer. But Ottinger really covered up for them. So he kind of needs to be that goaltender again, but they need goals. This team needs goals. Detroit, if they make the playoffs, they'll be in the underdog position as well. I think for Detroit to get there, they need a lot of their young kids to come of age now. So a lot of their young kids have to come of age now, and their rookies have to play like veterans, which we've seen with rookies last year with Detroit, with both Raymond and Seider, not seeming to have much time needed at all to acclimate themselves to the NHL game. So they need more of that, and they need a goaltender to emerge as well from their two goaltenders that will be the absolute starter going into the playoffs. Edmonton, Jack Campbell's going to be under a lot of pressure in Edmonton this year. Edmonton is rightfully being considered a contender. I have seen one publication putting them in the Stanley Cup final this year. Whether or not they end up getting there, I think the goaltending could decide that. But scoring depth is going to be huge for Edmonton. Their blue line, I think, is better than it gets credit for. But yeah, the scoring depth is going to be key. Scoring from the wings, right? This is a team that traditionally, in the McDavid era, they've had problems with that depth scoring. I think Holloway could be a huge add. I'll do a video later on today talking about, once we've got the final rosters for everybody, getting into who made the team, who didn't, and all this. But with the Oilers, I want to talk about Holloway a bit, and how he could be really the X factor for the Oilers. So if it's an X factor video I put together, when I get to Holloway, act surprised. That's important. Florida. Florida's being favored by some, as we are going into a season where there's at least 5 or 6 teams you can make really legitimate arguments for, and Florida's one of them. Bobrovsky had a good year. Knight clearly is going to get his share of starts this year as well, so Bobrovsky's going to get nights off for Knight. And their defense is good. Their offense is solid. Really, for Florida, they have to play more of a playoff style this year than they did last year. As exciting and fun as Florida games were to watch, it wasn't playoff-style hockey, and I think they struggled with the transition to playoff-style hockey, which got them eliminated in the second round. I think that was a big part of it. You guys can let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, though, as always. LA Kings, being back in the playoffs, they like being underdogs. Jonathan Quick, Ante Kopitar, Drew Doughty, all that fun stuff. There are some really good veterans here. And so I don't take the Kings lightly when it comes to playoffs, especially if they're underdogs, especially if they were like second wild card. Yeah, that might be just where they want to be. Remember, in the 2012 season where they won the Stanley Cup, they did not have a good regular season record. Nobody was taking them to win the Stanley Cup going into the 2012 playoffs that I can remember. So, although my memory being a bit spotty at my age. So, for the LA Kings, I think it could happen, but they're going to need another really serious run from Quick, and it's been a little over a decade since that one, so maybe he's itching for another. And in the last year of his contract, too. So they need Doughty to stay healthy. They need, their veterans to keep things together. And Danault to prove that last year wasn't just a one-off, that he can produce like that every year. Danault looked fantastic for them. Minnesota's come out of this preseason looking pretty good, right? And Boldy and Rossi both look like they're going to be dominant top six forwards for Minnesota. They need that. They need Kaprizov to continue to show that he can be a 100-point producer, and for that line with Zuccarello and Hartman to really click. Their blue line needs to hold together. Their goaltending, they do have Marc-Andre Fleury. Marc-Andre Fleury has taken a team to a Stanley Cup not that long ago. 2018's not that long ago. So, I mean, it's possible they could do that again and do that for the Minnesota Wild. So maybe a little bit of a magic elixir for Marc-Andre Fleury to make him feel a little bit younger and make the aches and pains go away a little bit quicker. Bones heal a little bit faster if need be. Hopefully not. But yeah, that's Minnesota, I think, is in that, not necessarily contention like top five, but they're definitely in that dark horse category. Imagine if the Stanley Cup final was between Columbus and Minnesota. Two teams have never won a Stanley Cup, and they come into the league together. Montreal. For Montreal, it would be ridiculous if they made the playoffs. So I mentioned Luke Richardson for Chicago would be coach of the year if they made the playoffs. Marty St. Louis would be for Montreal as well. Absolutely. Coach of the year. They'd have a statue up for him. There's no way this roster should be near a playoff spot. But there are a lot of young kids on this team. And if the kids, again, as I mentioned previously in this video already, if they can come in and play like veterans and don't need a lot of time to get up to speed, maybe Montreal wins more games than we expect. And Montreal is overdue for a bit of a run themselves. When was the last time Montreal reached a Stanley Cup final? Exactly. So they're way overdue. Montreal's way overdue for a Stanley Cup as well, so maybe we can just argue they're due. Even though reality would tell us they are deep in a rebuild. Nashville. Making the argument for Nashville, I think the good news for Nashville, they're being overlooked a little more this year, and I say that's good news because when they made the run in 2017, they were completely overlooked. Absolutely, it looked like going into round one, well, they're against Chicago. Chicago will knock them out. Yeah, Nashville's had a good run, and then Nashville swept them and went all the way to the Stanley Cup final. So they're going to need Saros to beat Pekka Rinne for that run. I think he's capable of it, but he's got to be in net for them, right? Nashville against Colorado was a mismatch on every level, but not having Saros in net absolutely hurt Nashville, as good as Connor Ingram was in that series. For New Jersey, they are definitely a team that might be taken lightly when it comes to playoff contention. Maybe by myself too, sure. New Jersey does have a lot of pieces that, and again, it's a lot of young players, that if their development is sped up a little bit this year, they absolutely could be a contender. I do have some concerns in net if we're talking about an actual Stanley Cup win, but Blackwood's shown the ability to raise this game before. It has been a while. There's been a lot of injuries since then. But yeah, for New Jersey, I think that's possible again but they have to be able to get to the playoffs first. And then you have to have Dougie Hamilton, I'm going to prove my contract. I'm going to prove it. And prove it's worth it. So we'll see how that goes. For the New York Islanders, they need to bounce back from last season, get back into the playoffs, which I don't think is that tough of an ask. And I know how far they were outside the playoffs, but the start of the season really sunk them. And maybe with Lane Lambert behind the bench, maybe that'll make the difference. They do need, I think, more goals than what they were producing under Barry Trotz. I think the goaltending's fantastic. The defense is excellent. Open up the game a little bit and let your offensive players like Wahlstrom, like Barzal, like Bellows really show what they can do. And I think it hurts some of the younger players' development just a little bit when they're not given that free rein out there for fear they might make a mistake, which I think at times has been the case with the New York Islanders. The New York Rangers, well, they got close last year, didn't they? It's Igor, isn't it? Igor won them a lot of games last year, and so it drives the analytical community a little bit nuts, because when you look at 5-on-5 chances and everything last season, the Rangers weren't very good, but Shesterkin was fantastic. So they need that again, but they also need to improve their 5-on-5 play, not have to rely on him so much. I think they have the manpower to be able to do that. And so, yeah, the Rangers absolutely in the hunt. I have them in the Stanley Cup final against Colorado in my predictions. So we'll see how it goes. Because again, it's the season starts tomorrow, so who knows? Who knows who makes the playoffs? Half the league misses the playoffs. I like that. Ottawa favored to get to the playoffs, but a Stanley Cup looks like it's a bridge too far. I would say that you would need Stützle to be around, a 100-point player, and you would need DeBrincat to score about 50 for this team to really be a contender going in and to really make people think about it. But either way, if they get into the playoffs, Ottawa has shown in the past as well that they do better as underdogs. I believe that. I think they're pretty solid as underdogs. It's part of the reason I like cheering for Ottawa come playoff time. Although they don't win Stanley Cups, they're pretty good underdogs. So maybe they're due for a run as well. It's been a while since the run that infamously was right before the Matt Duchene trade. So it's been a while since that now. Maybe Ottawa's due. A Stanley Cup, that's a tough ask. Even though I do expect this team to be a lot better this year. Philadelphia is not easy either. Tortorella, yeah. Again, this is the same as Chicago and Montreal. I'll go ahead and say Andre Tourigny wins Coach of the Year, Coach of the Century if Arizona makes the playoffs. But Coach of the Year for Tortorella if Philly makes the playoffs, absolutely. They would need everybody to come together, and whatever issues are going on in the locker room, which Tortorella said himself are there, that would all need to be ironed out going into the playoffs. That would need to be ironed out before they get into the playoffs, or they probably don't make the playoffs. But for Philadelphia to win a Stanley Cup, Carter Hart has to play like he was expected to when he was drafted. And I think he can. There's some debate about whether or not he gets there, but yeah, I mean he can, but that's really important to have that goaltending there. And you'd have to have a healthy Sean Couturier who is doing his best to score goals and shut down opposing forwards on top lines. So it's a lot of work, and that blue line has to be better than it looks on paper right now. Pittsburgh, it's simple. Crosby plays like Crosby. They don't have the injuries in goal that they had last year. Letang stays healthy, and everybody's on the same page. Malkin is as he can be. Malkin can be an absolute beast in the playoffs. He can be invisible as well, sometimes in the same game. So if you get that consistency, yeah, Pittsburgh can win another Stanley Cup. Whenever I hear about, this window's closed and that window's closed, windows. I'm not worried about windows and doors open, and not worried about that at all. Unless I'm paying the heating bill, in which case keep the door and the windows closed. But yeah, Pittsburgh, I think with Crosby, Malkin, I always say I don't bet against the Penguins. This is why I never take them as a team that's going to miss the playoffs. Because even though on paper I might look at the team and go, I don't know how spectacular that is, I know they're going to overplay, or they're going to, the term I'm looking for, they're going to basically overachieve, right? That's what they're going to do in a regular season. Postseason's been a problem since 2018, but they're due. San Jose, there's a lot of teams that are due, right? San Jose, it's tough to make the argument, and I didn't see anything in those two games in Prague to change my mind on that. For San Jose, Reimer was the better of the two goaltenders in Prague. Obviously, it's a one-game sample size, but they need one of those two goalies to really emerge. If you're going to win 4 rounds in the playoffs, that's important. Erik Karlsson has to be 2017 Erik Karlsson, when Erik Karlsson was absolutely a beast on one leg. Like, it didn't matter how hurt and how banged up he was getting on the ice. And I think part of the reason that he's had a lot of the injury problems over the last 4 years he's had is because he was pushing himself to play through injury prior to that. But he needs to get back to that. And Vlasic looks to be having a bounce back. So if you're looking for a silver lining out of those two games, Vlasic looked pretty good. They need that. They need their defense to hold up. And even though they sent down Bortolo or Eklund, at some point this year, one or the other is going to come up. Production there could be useful. And Logan Couture needs to be an absolute beast if they're going to win a Stanley Cup. Seattle, this is not an easy one either. A 60-point team last year. But they picked up Burakovsky. They picked up some decent forwards, and their goaltending is due for a bounce back. And their defense, I think, is due for a bit of a bounce back too. Stanley Cup's tough to get to. I I don't know that they have that superstar that's ready yet, but I mean, Beniers kind of has to win the Calder. Wright would have to be fantastic. A lot of things have to fall the right direction for Seattle to win a Stanley Cup. And yeah, it's one of those things that, I mean, I would be fascinated if it happened. How frustrating that would be to fans in Buffalo and Toronto and Vancouver, just to name three. It'd be pretty epic, right? I can just see the memes now, right? But yeah, Seattle, it is tough to cross that bridge. For St. Louis, a little bit easier, right? St. Louis won the cup in 2019. Now Bennington's the basically undisputed starter for them. And so it's a matter of O'Reilly, who's on the final year of his contract, maybe puts the team on his back a bit in the playoffs. Tarasenko's in the final year of his contract. If they don't trade him, guys might look at this and say it's our last go around, it's our last hurrah. Something that I thought might help Pittsburgh win in the playoffs last year and almost did, but then didn't. So if St. Louis can treat this like, hey, it's the last time before, the band gets broken up, that might help them out a lot. And then you kind of need Torrey Krug to be able to produce for them in the playoffs the way that Pietrangelo did in 2019, which is not easy. Tampa Bay, they're the Bolts. They're the Bolts. They've won 2 Stanley Cups, 2020 and 2021. They lost in the final in 2022. And really, they just need to keep going the same way. They're going to have to avoid injury. They're going to have to figure out how to, navigate the cap. They're not the only team. Half the league's trying to navigate the exact same problem now. So when people talk about, of course, Tampa's over the cap. Yeah, no, glass houses. Half of us are in that glass house right now. So yeah, Tampa Bay really needs, good health from its players. They did lose some depth there in the offseason. So we'll see how it goes for them this year. Whether or not losing Palat hurts them come playoff time. But if Ross Colton can jump up, if they get another player to jump up and get those goals, if Killorn can get in there and get goals he wasn't getting in last year's playoffs, as a for instance, then that helps. But yeah, Tampa Bay's not far off because Vasilevsky. Toronto. Stop laughing. Toronto absolutely is a contender. This is the reality of it. Toronto is a contender. They are absolutely a playoff team. I can't see them missing the playoffs. I do think they'll miss Jack Campbell a bit, but I don't know for how long. I agree that Jack Campbell's contract probably outside the realm of what they're able to pay their goaltending, considering their own cap situation. But they need a bounce back from Murray. I think that's possible. They're going to need that depth to be there, and they need their scorers to be scorers come playoff time. They need Matthews, Marner, Tavares, all these guys to be healthy and to be their best players. And in a big game, they need to be the guys who make the difference. If Toronto gets out of the first round, and again, I understand that people want to make a whole joke out of the whole thing, and I get it. I've snickered at some of the memes myself, but once they get out of that first round, once that day comes, hopefully it comes soon, that could really springboard them to getting past the second round, and then who knows from there, right? They make it to the Final Four. Anything is possible. Toronto absolutely could be that team, but they need Murray or Samsonov. Murray's got 2 cup rings. If he can be that Matt Murray again, you're set. Vancouver, I will try. And I say this as somebody who is convinced the Vancouver Canucks will never win a Stanley Cup in my lifetime. And it's not because I'm not optimistic. Heck, I'm picking them to make the playoffs, even though there's a lot of people who aren't, and there's a lot of comments about, this team's still really bad. They're still going to be bad this year. Even though they weren't bad last year, they missed the playoffs by only a few points after a disastrous start to the season. But again, when you miss the playoffs, it is perceived that you're a bad team. So fine. Good. All right, good. But for Vancouver to win the Stanley Cup, well, they need Demko to Demko teams. Demko's become a verb in Vancouver terminology. They definitely need to stay healthy as well. And the blue line needs to just be solid. Doesn't have to be spectacular if Demko's spectacular. And Pettersson needs to show the rest of the world what I think he can do. I think Pettersson can be absolutely dynamic. I think he can be the best forward they've had, not named Sedin, since the Sedins came into the league. But again, we need to see that on the ice. We need to see that over 82 games. And Quinn Hughes. Quinn Hughes can be the man. I really believe that. So there's a lot of things that have to go right here. Vegas misses the playoffs, but there are still a lot of people picking them to get back in. I think that is quite possible. They do need to avoid injury. Obviously, their goaltending is, at this point, a curiosity. Borderlining on concern because you do have Brossoit coming back off injury. Thompson's never been a starter. Leonard's missing the whole season. So there's some concern with Vegas' goaltending. That'd have to stand up if they're going to make it to a Stanley Cup and win it. Stone has to be Stone. He can't be the injured, broken version we saw at the end of last year. And they need to win those games. There were so many games they lost last year that they probably should have won. Games they would have won in year one. They need to get back to being that team. I need to be standing here a lot and saying they won for Vegas reasons. Those kinds of wins that you look and you go, how did that happen? And they steal it from the other team. So that's important. For the Capitals, Ovechkin. It really comes down to Ovechkin and what he can do to lead the team. If, we know he's going to get to the 800 goal mark this year. We know that he is, at least within shouting distance of the Wayne Gretzky record for goals. It's not going to happen this year, obviously, not next year either. But at any rate, he is getting closer. But it needs to be about the team. Darcy Kemper is coming off of a cup win. That's good. They definitely need to have the fountain of youth, and they need some good health for Backstrom when he comes back if they're going to win a Stanley Cup. For the Jets, so we close out with Winnipeg. Here we are, 26 minutes in and all that. But for the Jets, to me, it's simply a matter of they can't underachieve as they did last year. I really think the Jets underachieved pretty badly last year. This is a good team on paper. They just have to be that way. They're saying all the right things about buying into Bonus's systems. Rick Bowness did get Dallas to a Stanley Cup final in 2020. So if they buy in and they really listen, they can get that success that they're looking for. They need to be strong defensively, and they need Hellebuck to be Vezina level if they're going to win a Stanley Cup. But I rule them as being one of those kind of in-between teams. There you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.